This video was brought to you by Brilliant. The first 200 people to use the link below get 20% off an annual subscription. While generally speaking, members of NATO are in favour of their membership, there appears to be a growing resentment towards NATO among certain communities online. One such potentially unlikely opponent of NATO is the far left. How come though? Aren't the left meant to be in favour of global cooperation and organisations that foster peace? Well, let's have a look into this. To fully understand this, we need to first understand why NATO was created and what it's for. The roots of NATO are in the Second World War. The pact was initiated between France and the UK, and this took effect on the 4th of March 1947 following the signing of the Treaty of Dunkirk. Eventually, this pact expanded, initially to include the Benelux countries, through the Treaty of Brussels. Eventually, by 1949, the pact expanded to include the US, Canada, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Denmark and Iceland. This was through the North Atlantic Treaty. This is when NATO was officially founded. The point of this pact originally was to try and balance against Germany and the USSR. While the West tolerated the USSR during the Second World War, it was accepted that this was simply to try and defeat the bigger evil that was the Nazi war machine. There was always going to be an arms race between the East and the West post-war. The West weren't actually in a very good position following victory in 1945. They were economically and militarily weak. The Soviet Union had a much larger military and had dominated their surrounding states. There was obvious anxiety about the Soviets' position in Europe and a clear desire to try and defend against them. Following the collapse of the USSR, theoretically, NATO wasn't really balancing against anything. Despite this, NATO continued to exist. Some would argue that those who are left of centre would back such an institution anyway, irrespective of this technicality. Those who are left of centre, it could be argued, may be in favour of more of these alliances, whereas those on the right of centre would argue for a more unilateral foreign policy. There are some examples in the last few years of this being true. Donald Trump often tried to withdraw from international alliances. During his term as president, he withdrew from the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, UNESCO, and UNHRC. When Biden came to power, one of the first things he did was rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization. However, the link between the traditional left-right dichotomy and international relations theories is just unfortunately not that clear. While it's true that some on the left may agree with the conception of international organisations, some may subscribe to Marxist international relations theory, which would reject international institutions that serve capitalism. If we go back to the 1975 EEC referendum in the UK, the precursor to the EU, we can see that those on the left of the Labour Party worked with the No campaign. They saw the EEC as a capitalist group and, as such, didn't want the UK to be part of it. The point we're making is that while it may appear that the left is broadly in favour of NATO, it's not quite that universal, and there are parts of the left that have been, and remain, opposed to NATO. The argument basically goes that NATO isn't protecting anyone, it's doing the opposite. Its continued existence maintains the West versus East paradigm that characterised the Cold War. To NATO's critics, this is not desirable and actually stokes tension, with the world becoming sort of like a big game of Risk, with NATO slowly gaining territory and antagonising countries like Russia, thus increasing the chances of conflict. Although this debate has recently kicked off in some left-wing subreddits, this isn't actually a new opinion. Back in 1998, there was a vote in the US Senate on whether to accept new members into NATO. 10 Democratic senators and 9 Republican senators voted against this. Paul Wellstone of Minnesota argued that there is peace between states in Europe, between nations in Europe, for the first time in centuries. We do not have a divided Europe, and I worry about a NATO expansion which could redivide Europe and, again, poison relations with Russia. Going further with this argument, Stephen Wareheim of the New York Times argued that, in the late 1990s, to the US, the expansion of NATO seemed cost-free. There was no real cost to admitting more countries, and in doing so, they expanded the borders of the West even further. While senators such as Wellstone were opposed, their threats of war in Europe didn't seem tangible and immediate. Some proponents of this argument may even partially blame NATO for the current war in Ukraine, arguing that NATO's expansion pushed Russia into a corner and caused a response. Wertheim even goes as far as saying that NATO gives the US legitimacy to fight wars while claiming that they have international support. An example he gives is the fighting in the Middle East, such as in Libya in 2011. While this was a NATO operation, it was a disaster. But the president could convince the American people that there was wide support for the operation because the US-dominated NATO backed it. This itself builds into another major argument against NATO by some on the left. They claim the organisation promotes American capitalism in other countries. Simply, if you're a socialist or a communist, you obviously don't support this aim. Anyway, these are the arguments against NATO from a leftist perspective. This isn't to say, though, that these arguments hold or are right. In an interview with International Viewpoint, Teros Bilaus argues that one of the main things that the left don't take into account is that people in Ukraine, and other countries between the West and Russia, have their own political subjectivity and ability to decide their own fate. In essence, NATO isn't imposed on anyone. Countries choose to join it. Bilaus goes on to criticise the argument that NATO's expansion in the 90s was a US project. While some may criticise the US for allowing countries to join NATO and the effect it may have on the relationship with Russia, the left have forgotten that these countries applied to join NATO. Eastern European countries who joined NATO did so because there was support from their populations, specifically because it guarantees them security from Russia, who may impose a way of life on them that they don't want. Bilaus argues that the leftist criticism is largely rooted in the fact that a lot of the wars and military interventions may be fought seemingly just to benefit the West. About this, he says, "That is understandable. You have mainly protested against wars that were in the interests of the West. We have been living with a war in the east of the country for 8 years. So we have had some time to rethink our position. But I think leftists need to understand better that situations can change very quickly. If leftists continue to blame NATO for the Russian invasion, then they show that they have not understood the changed situation. Ultimately, it seems, whether you agree with Bilaus or Wertheim depends on your fundamental view of NATO. If you think it's American-led and mainly benefits the West while risking the peace, then you're more likely to side with Wertheim and the left. If you truly think it's a security pact designed to help countries like Ukraine against warmongering neighbours, then you're more likely to agree with Bilaus.
Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform that teaches you everything you need to know to better understand the modern world. Baffled by investment and finance? Well, they've got courses on maths and quantitative finance. Confused by coding? Well, they've got everything from the very basics right through to quantum computing. Unclear why you're losing millions? Well, there's no guarantee that Brilliant can help with that, but they do have courses on cryptocurrency and gambling. You get the point. Everything you want to learn about STEM is covered by Brilliant. And the best thing is that all of their courses are designed by award-winning instructors and built upon the principle of active learning. So you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. So if you want to improve with STEM, then you can sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDREU. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for supporting the channel.